The first few days of your marriage were spent walking on invisible eggshells. You drifted from one corner of the house to another, finding excuses to keep your hands occupied. Wiping an already spotless counter. Folding clothes Jungkook had already folded. Reaching for the laundry before remembering the washing machine did most of the work on its own. And every time you did that, he would quietly stop you. Not harshly, but just with a gentle, "You don't have to." At first, you thought he was only being polite. Then the days passed, and nothing changed. He really didn't expect you to cook, or clean, or spend your mornings trying to prove you deserved to stay there. Little by little, you began to understand that your husband wasn't a man who measured a wife's worth by the work she could do around the house. Yet there was one thing you noticed. Whenever he found you sitting quietly with your books, completely absorbed in another chapter, his gaze would linger for just a moment longer before he returned to whatever he had been doing. He never praised you, never reminded you to study, but there was a quiet ease in his expression whenever he saw you like that. And somehow, your own heart eased with it. Perhaps there was still a way to repay his kindness, to make sure he never regretted marrying you. It wasn't through spotless floors or warm meals waiting on the table. It was through the dream he had quietly placed back into your hands. So, you stayed tucked away in your room, bent over the study table he had bought for you, brows drawn together in quiet concentration. Hours slipped by unnoticed as your fingers turned the crisp pages of textbooks that still carried the scent of fresh print. Sometimes, your gaze would fall to your own hands. You hardly recognized them anymore. The angry cuts that had once crossed your knuckles had faded into pale lines. The roughness that years of scrubbing dishes had carved into your skin had slowly given way to softness. Even your nails, once bitten short and uneven, were now neatly trimmed, moving hesitantly across the laptop's keyboard. You were still learning. It was the first laptop you had ever called your own. Although you had insisted you could manage without one, that the books were enough. Yet Jungkook had quietly disagreed. "It'll make studying easier," was all he had said. A soft knock drew your attention away from the screen. Your door was rarely closed. Somewhere, you wanted him to approach you, ask you for any help you could provide.
But instead of asking anything out of you, Jungkook had long since fallen into the quiet habit of stopping by during your study sessions, sometimes with a bowl of freshly cut fruits, sometimes with a sandwich, a glass of milk sweetened lightly with honey, anything to keep you full during your long study sessions. Even today, he stepped inside without hesitation, placing the warm glass of hot chocolate carefully on the bedside table, before turning towards you. "Aren't you done yet?" Jungkook's eyes wandered over the sea of notes scattered across your bed, before settling on the open books and laptop spread across the study table. "It's already 11, Yuna." His gaze returned to you. "You must be tired." The room was bathed in warm light. Fatigue lingered beneath your eyes. But there was something else too. A quiet brightness that hadn't been there a few days ago. They reminded him of distant stars, faint yet unwavering against the night. "No," you shook your head lightly. "I'm not tired. I've always had a habit of studying late into the night." Jungkook was quiet for a moment. "But you wake up early every morning." A faint crease formed between his brows. "When do you sleep?" You lowered your eyes. "Around 2. One of his brows lifted ever so slightly. Almost instinctively, you pressed your lips together. You didn't want to disappoint him. Not because your mother had warned you to keep him pleased, but because somewhere, in these few days, he had proven to be the only person who had ever rooted for you ever so sincerely in your entire life. You fumbled over the words in a hurry to explain. "I'm sorry. I won't stay up so late from tomorrow." Instead of answering immediately, Jungkook walked over until he was standing beside your chair. "It's all right. Nothing to apologize for." Your heart flipped the same motion it did every time he called you like that. Stress does that sometimes. You blinked. He wasn't angry. The breath you hadn't realized you'd been holding escaped quietly.
You had spent so many years waiting for irritation to follow every mistake that your body had learned to brace itself before your mind ever could. Even now, when there was nothing to fear, the habit remained. Just drink the milk before it gets cold. He gave the glass a small nod before turning towards the door. Jungkook, your voice stopped him. Almost unconsciously, your fingers curled around the edge of the desk. If staying awake hadn't upset him, perhaps this would. He turned back, waiting. You gathered your courage one careful breath at a time. I was thinking, I wanted to go back to my part-time job, at the cafe. The way his brows cinched together softly made you realize he didn't know anything about this. So you bit your lips before continuing. I used to work 2 other jobs as well. A nervous pause. But I think one would be enough now. Your voice grew quieter with each word, until it barely rose above a whisper. You worked 3 jobs. For the first time that evening, disbelief colored Jungkook's voice. Your eyes flickered back to him before dropping once more. Yeah, before. You couldn't explain anymore. How were you even supposed to explain it? That keeping the lights on had cost money. That groceries didn't appear on their own. That surviving every month demanded something from you. And by the time everything else had been paid for, there was rarely enough left to think about yourself.
However, now things were different. Jungkook had never once asked you to contribute to the household expenses. His mother had bought you expensive skincare, luxurious, and even comfortable clothes. All of these, they alone felt like more generosity than you had ever known. Which was exactly why asking him to pay for something as personal as your own books, or bus fare, or even sanitary pads felt unbearably difficult. Meanwhile, working seemed easier. Jungkook studied your face for a quiet moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. The moment his figure disappeared into the hallway, you were already on your feet. Your heart lurched. You knew it. You had asked for too much. What respectable husband would want his wife serving tables in a cafe? Your thoughts spiraled faster than you could stop them. Was this it? Would this be the moment where his demeanor would finally change toward you? Would the patience that had felt almost impossible these past few days finally run out? Or worse, your throat tightened. Would he call your mother? Before you even realized what you were doing, your feet were already carrying you into the hallway. Your steps quickened of their own accord until you found yourself standing outside his bedroom door. For a brief moment, your hand hovered over the doorknob. You had never entered his room before. Then, before a greater fear could persuade you otherwise, you quietly pushed the door open. Through the blur gathering in your eyes, you found Jungkook standing beside the dresser, one of the drawers pulled open as he searched for something. I'm sorry, Jungkook. Your voice cracked almost immediately. I won't go back to the cafe, if you don't want me to. He turned at the sound of your voice, but you immediately lowered your head. You hurriedly dragged the back of your hand across your face, trying to wipe the tears flowing freely now. Please, don't send me back. Jungkook's heart clenched painfully the moment he looked at you. Your whole body was trembling. Your breaths came unevenly, as though each one had to fight its way out. For a second, he simply stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The next breath, his feet had already crossed the distance between you. His hands instinctively reached for your arms, and the moment his fingers brushed against you, he felt you flinch. His movements faltered. For the briefest moment, he wondered if he should step back. But then he heard your breathing hitch again. This wasn't just crying. You were having trouble breathing. A heartbeat later, he gently pulled you into his arms. Your forehead rested against his chest as his hand came up to cradle the back of your head. Hey. His voice was barely above a whisper. You're all right. I'm not sending you anywhere, Yen. He slowly ran his fingers through your hair, each movement unhurried. You're safe. You swallowed against the tightness in your throat, but nothing came out. Jungkook felt the tension slowly leave your body, little by little, though your shoulders still trembled beneath his hands. Quiet sobs gave way to uneven breaths, broken now and then by small hiccups. He didn't speak. He simply continued rubbing slow circles against your back, again and again, until the only sound left between you was the occasional sniffle muffled against his chest. For a long moment, neither of you moved. Then, when your breathing had finally begun to settle, he spoke.
Hey. His hand rested reassuringly against the back of your head. You're not going anywhere, Yen. A brief pause. I'm here. What made you so scared? His voice, like always, steadied something inside you, just as surely as his embrace had. And only then did you realize how tightly you were clutching his shirt. Heat crept into your cheeks. Your fingers loosened almost at once. Then slowly, you drew your head away from his chest. The words refused to come. You tried again. I thought you were angry for asking if I could go back to work. Jungkook followed your gaze as it settled on the floor. He had begun to notice you did that whenever you felt you had done something wrong. And he didn't want you feeling that way. So, gently tipping your chin upward with his forefinger, he asked, "And why would you think that?" Quiet confusion laced his voice. Because your brows knitted together. You left the room. The explanation sounded strangely unreasonable the moment you said it aloud. Yet, only a few moments ago, it had felt terrifyingly real. Something flickered across Jungkook's face. Understanding. A quiet sigh escaped him. I see. His hand slipped gently to your shoulder, guiding you to the edge of the bed. Sit down for a second. Then he quietly walked back across the room. But this time, he had made sure not to leave without a word. Your eyes followed him as he opened one of the drawers and searched for something inside. A moment later, he returned carrying a glass of water and a small card. Your eyes widened when you noticed it was a black card resting between his fingers. The moment you opened your mouth to say something, Jungkook had already lifted the glass of water to your lips. Drink this first. You didn't protest. The cool water disappeared in 3 hurried gulps, soothing the dryness in your throat. As you leaned forward to place the empty glass on the bedside table, he quietly slipped the card into your hands. You're right. He held your gaze, his expression as calm as ever. I don't want you going back to the cafe. Not because there's anything wrong with the work. I just don't want you worrying about how you'll afford to study. Use the card whenever you need to, Yen. There wasn't the slightest hesitation in his voice. No explanations. When you still didn't move, he understood your hesitation. You're my wife, Yen. You shouldn't have to worry about whether you can afford to chase your dreams. Slowly, fresh tears welled in your eyes. Not from fear or anxiety this time, but because your heart suddenly felt too full to hold everything it was feeling. You moistened your lips before pressing them together. Thank you. Your fingers curled carefully around the card. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this. A small crease settled between Jungkook's brows. He lowered himself onto the bed beside you, leaving just enough space for you to breathe comfortably, before resting a reassuring arm around your shoulders. Don't thank me. His voice carried the same quiet certainty as before. It's my responsibility to look after you. His thumb absent-mindedly traced slow circles over your arm. And if you really want to repay me, how about you become the doctor you've always wanted to be, For the first time since your marriage, a genuine smile found its way to your lips. It was small, almost timid. You still didn't understand why he had chosen to be so patient with you, whether he was simply this kind by nature, or whether life had, for once, been gentler to you than you had ever expected. All you knew was that, somewhere along the way, you had begun hoping this quiet little life beside him would last a long, long time. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. You sat cross-legged on the floor of your bedroom, your laptop balanced across your knees, your brows drawn together as you tried to make sense of the problem staring back at you from the screen. You would search through browser after browser, even ask the AI the same question in 3 different ways. Nothing seemed to help.
Computer still felt like a language everyone else had somehow learned long before you. With a defeated huff, you shut the laptop halfway, before pushing yourself to your feet. Without giving it another thought, you padded downstairs. Jungkook was home today, which meant he was most likely in his study. By now, walking into his study no longer felt nearly as intimidating as it had in the beginning. You had lost count of how many times you had wandered in with questions that felt
embarrassingly simple. You found yourself watching his face every now and then, searching for the faintest trace of impatience. It never came. He never laughed, never sighed, never made you feel foolish for not knowing. Instead, he would patiently explain each step, waiting until you understood before moving on to the next. And somewhere along the way, you had begun looking forward to those little interruptions. The smile that had formed on your lips at your own thoughts, they disappeared the moment you reached the doorway. No, she won't. Jungkook's voice drifted through the half-open study door. Yen isn't herein, Mom. Your heart gave an unexpected thud. A knot slowly tightened in your stomach. His voice was low, yet the quietness of the house carried every word with startling clarity. You hadn't meant to overhear. You should leave. You knew that. Yet hearing him speak your name kept you rooted where you stood. You were right. His voice softened. She's kind. You heard the faint sound of him exhaling. I don't feel like I'm intruding someone else's life anymore. I think... His voice grew quieter still. It's been a long time since the house felt this peaceful. Silence. Then, I just don't want to burden her with... The rest of the sentence disappeared into the distance. Perhaps he had stepped out into the garden, or the call had simply moved farther away. You couldn't tell. You remained standing where you were, motionless. Hiren. Until now, she had only ever been your husband's late wife, nothing more. Yet, somehow, the few words you had overheard painted a picture that confused you even more. Not once, not even by accident, had you found a single trace of another woman in the house. No framed wedding photographs, no forgotten belongings, no lingering memories left carelessly behind. It was as though she had lived there and then quietly vanished. You couldn't quite understand the emotion in Jungkook's voice. He hadn't sounded angry, nor bitter. If anything, he had sounded relieved. Relieved that you weren't Hiren. And for the first time since your marriage, you found yourself wondering who your husband had been before you ever became part of his life. Those thoughts lingered at the back of your mind for the rest of the day, even when Jungkook called you downstairs for dinner. Even now, as you sat quietly at the dining table, watching him move around the kitchen. He reached for bowls, stirred the soup, and opened cupboards without needing to think. Every movement was quiet, practiced, as though he had long grown accustomed to doing these things on his own. Somehow, it felt strangely at odds with the life you had imagined a married man would have lived. Jungkook noticed your gaze following him around the kitchen as he ladled soup into the bowls. Is something on your mind, Yen? He finally looked up before taking the seat opposite you. His voice finally pulled you from your thoughts. Only then did you realize you had been staring. Heat rose faintly to your cheeks. Quietly tucking a loose strand of hair behind your ear, he reached for the serving bowl before giving a small shake of your head. No, not really. He didn't press further. Not because he hadn't noticed, but because there was something weighing on his own mind. His fingers absently traced the rim of his bowl before he looked at you again. Yen. You immediately lifted your head. He hesitated, clearing his throat as though searching for the right words. Can I ask you something? You nodded. How would you feel? He paused. About Aira staying with us for a few weeks. Your heart stilled. It had been almost a month since your wedding, and yet you had never once met Era. She had stayed at his mother's house all this time. Perhaps he visited her after work before coming home. Perhaps his mother brought her over while you were buried in your books. You weren't sure. He had never really spoken about her. Jungkook noticed the way you froze. Mistaking your silence for hesitation, he let out a quiet sigh.
I know this is sudden, but I won't let her disturb your studies. He paused briefly before continuing. My mother has to leave town for a few weeks. She can't take Era with her. She's only 10 months old. His eyes searched yours. So, I was wondering if she could stay here instead. A faint crease settled between his brows. If you're uncomfortable, we'll think of something else. I just didn't want to make the decision without asking you first. It's okay, Jungkook. You answered almost immediately. Why would I mind? The tension quietly slipped from his shoulders. Relief softened his features almost instantly. Watching him, you couldn't help but wonder. Why had he been so afraid to ask? Why did he need your permission to bring his own daughter into her own home? You had never been a curious person, never to pry into someone else's life, but this time, you couldn't help but ask him. Jungkook, if you are comfortable, can I ask something about your first wife? He watched him going still. Then, a sharp exhale. What do you want to ask, Yen? The calmness in his voice gave you all the courage you needed to go further. How was she? You saw him fidget with the spoon without meeting your eyes. She was scared. Silence enveloped the dining table. Then, ever so quietly, he added, of life. Before he could get up, your mouth stumbled the next question. How did she... He halted. Then you continued. Die. He had his back turned to you, so you only heard the quiet murmur. Suicide. The color drained from your face. You couldn't ask or say anything else. Not because the thought of taking your own life was frightening. No. You yourself had had that thought multiple times. But before you could ever think of taking that step, a cold, pure, white fear had always gripped you. And whenever you heard about someone taking that step, you couldn't help but wonder. Just how helpless had that person felt? How lonely? How burdened could a soul become for death to feel like the kindest escape? Sleep barely visited you that night. You kept tossing and turning, wondering about Hae-rin, about your husband's late wife. How could a woman who had a caring man like Jungkook as her husband ever take such a cruel step and leave behind the little life she had brought into this world? A little creak by the door suddenly made your heart thud. Through the darkness of the room, you opened your lids a little. A dark silhouette stood by the door. It wasn't difficult to recognize Jungkook. He quietly peeked into the room, his eyes moving through the darkness until they found your figure curled beneath the blanket. His eyes stayed on you for a few minutes before he quietly closed the door again. You didn't know how to feel about it. It might have been around 3 a.m. Did he always do that? Why wasn't he asleep? Was he just checking on you, or was it something else? You hugged the blanket tightly around yourself. You didn't know what was right to think and what wasn't. You didn't know what to make of him. You didn't know your husband. The next few days flew by. Little Era was in your home now, and you couldn't help but melt in adoration every time you saw her. Her little giggles, the scent of baby powder, her tiny clothes, it all filled the house with a kind of warmth you had been unaware of. You walked into the kitchen, and your heart melted watching Jungkook feeding the baby formula to Era.
his big hands clutching the small milk bottle to her lips, wiping the small droplets with the towel nearby. He wasn't making any exaggerated expressions to entertain her, but you could see him, smiling wider, eyebrows raising in quiet appraisal whenever she took a big sip. You watched as Era's big eyes left her father's for a brief moment and settle on yours. And that drew Jungkook's attention as well. You smiled at him, then pointed to his abandoned breakfast. It'll go cold. Jungkook glanced over the table once, then sighed. It's okay. She needs to have her breakfast first. Otherwise, I won't make it to the office. You walked over, then gently patted Era's head before planting a small kiss on her head. If you don't mind, I will feed her whilst you have your breakfast. His eyes softened. Then he quietly shook his head. Don't bother. She will throw a fight if she doesn't see familiar faces long enough. He saw you press your lips together, then added, It will take some time for her to recognize you, to know that you are safe. Don't worry. Then I'll reheat your breakfast. You took his plate and was about to turn, but he held your wrist with his free hand. Yen, just bring yours here. You have to study too. And that was your cue to cup your cheeks with one hand, hiding your blush, while taking small bites with the other one. You watched Jungkook finish feeding the little girl who quietly drifted back to sleep, and then he joined you. Your eyes kept switching between him and Era. How patiently he took care of her, bathed her, fed her, changed her diapers, and even managed his office. You couldn't help but always offer him help whenever you passed by, but he always rejected you, ever so politely.
You knew it wasn't lack of trust. If anything, he was doing his best to make you feel family and support your studies as well. Had he always been this selfless, so thoughtful? Wasn't a kindness as pure as his tiring? You quietly placed an egg into his bowl and lowered your eyes when he looked at you. You should eat well. You have a long day ahead. The brief moment of stillness that froze him made you wonder, was he ever in the receiving end of the care he seemed to shower others with? A sharp current, like sensation, thrilled your body at the sudden touch his fingers made with yours. He had placed some beans into your plate. You have to study well too. Crimson colored the tips of his ears, hands fidgeting with the chopsticks, as he tried and failed to act casual. On the other hand, you were a whole different story. Heartbeats so unusual you wondered you were sick, cheeks practically flaring up. Why was your body reacting this way to a mere brush of his fingers? Hadn't he once hugged you, rubbed your arms, held you close enough to feel his body heat? Had anything changed in the last few weeks? Maybe it had. His smile had changed. The warmth in his eyes that had always been there felt a little more intimate. The care in his tone a little more personal. Everything had changed, yet nothing truly had. You were still the wife of a man who didn't love you. Your heart clenched, and so did your fingers around your pen. You had been thinking about him ever since he left that morning. And now, you were feeling a foreign sadness you had never felt before. Sad that he didn't love you? Why were you even thinking about that? He fed you, clothed you, housed you. For God's sake, he even helped you study without expecting anything in return. You were free from the worries of survival. And now, with this better opportunity, all you should think about was how to get an even better life, to make the best of it, and become a doctor, like you had always dreamed of. Like Jungkook had been wishing for you. The inked words on the page blurred with your tears. What was this sudden, painful clench in your heart? Why did you suddenly want to be loved? Loved by your husband, a man who already had a daughter with someone else's. You realized, with a certain clarity, that you didn't mind his past. If Hae-rin had his heart once, you could accept that. All you wanted now was to stay. Stay by his side, and be the only woman he would ever hand his heart to again. Aira giggled as you puffed your cheeks at her. The two of you were in the living room.
It was late, already 10 at night, and Jungkook was still out of town, occupied with some important project. You still remembered the conflict that had crossed his face when he had told you he would have to leave the two of you alone for the whole day. This was the first time he did so. Jungkook usually took her with him whenever he went to the office, careful not to let her become a distraction to your studies. But lately, you had begun to crave their presence. Every evening, the moment they returned home, you would abandon the quiet comfort of your room and settle in the living room instead. From there, you had a perfect view of Aira playing in her crib, while Jungkook prepared dinner for the three of you. Sometimes you would read aloud the complicated biological terms from your textbooks, and she would babble after you in her tiny, incomprehensible voice. Your voices would mingle together, filling the once quiet house with a warmth and liveliness you had never realized you would come to cherish. But tonight, you found yourself pacing restlessly across the hall, dialing and redialing Jungkook's number. He was always home by 7, 8 at the latest. He always texted you beforehand if he was going to be late, and whenever you called, he picked up without fail, even if he was busy, even if he was sitting in the middle of a meeting. He would answer briefly, ask if something was wrong, and if it wasn't urgent, quietly tell you that he was occupied and would call you back later. You had grown accustomed to those little assurances. So tonight felt heavier. You bit your lip as you glanced toward Aira, who now slept peacefully in her crib, completely unaware of your growing unease. Your fingers hovered over Jungkook's name before tapping it one last time. No answer. You hesitated.
Then, reluctantly, you called his mother. Worry threaded through your voice as you asked if she knew where he was or what might have happened. There was a brief pause on the other end before she gave you his secretary's number. Jack. You were just about to call him when the doorbell rang. The crease between your brows deepened. Jungkook had his keys. Who could possibly be at the door at this hour? You approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. Your breath caught. You immediately flung the door open. What happened to him? Jack stood there, struggling to keep Jungkook upright. One of Jungkook's arms was slung heavily over his shoulder, his head hanging slightly, his entire weight seemingly surrendered to the man supporting him. Jack offered you an apologetic smile. Mr. Jeon knocked out after a few shots, Mrs. Jeon. He adjusted his grip on Jungkook, grimacing slightly beneath the weight. Can you help me? He's quite heavy. You ignored the embarrassing flutter in your heart at the title you had been addressed with, and moved quickly, grabbing one of Jungkook's hands and wrapping it around your shoulders. One hand supported his back as you tried to help him inside. The faint smell of alcohol reached your nose. But it wasn't the harsh, bitter smell you remembered from your mother's drinking. This was different. Warmer, smokier, faintly sweet, carrying the scent of oak and something almost vanilla-like beneath it. You and Jack struggled to get him inside, before finally lowering Jungkook onto the sofa. Jack didn't stay another moment. The instant he saw Jungkook's limbs tangled with yours, he seemed to decide that his presence was no longer necessary. You were grateful for that. What you weren't grateful for was the fact that your husband hadn't even bothered to text you that he had been drinking, or that he would be late. You huffed as you tried to loosen his tight grasp around your waist, but all you received in return was a low groan. Then, suddenly, a sharp jerk, and you were on his chest. Jungkook. A small, breathless gasp escaped your throat. Your palms pressed against his chest as you tried to hold yourself up, but his arms were ridiculously strong, and though your body had gained some healthy weight over the last 2 months of your marriage, you were still nowhere near a match for his strength. His heavy-lidded eyes struggled to blink open, and the moment they finally settled on you, he smiled. A lazy, drunken smile slowly etched itself across his flushed face. A shiver ran down your body. Shyness crept into your gaze as you quietly asked, "What are you doing?" Jungkook's face turned even redder, if that were possible. You could feel the steady thud of his heart beneath your palms. Perhaps it was even louder than yours. "You look like my wife,"
An unfamiliar pain cramped your chest, warmth draining from your face.